Hello and welcome to this webinar. We're going to be talking about preparing for CMMC, how to manage your digital supply chain risk. And my name is Eric Vanderberg. I'm Vice President of Cybersecurity at TCDI. And I'd like to allow my fellow presenters here to introduce themselves. James?
Hello there, my name is James McQuiggan. I'm a security awareness advocate over at KnowBe4, where we do security awareness training and phishing assessments. Excited to be here today to talk to you about the digital supply chain security.
And I'm Peter McClelland, and I am an attorney with Warden Smith, focusing on privacy, data security, and technology issues. We focus on clients in a variety of industries, including defense, manufacturing, running the whole gamut. And before that, I was with a cybersecurity company and worked on the task force for the Department of Homeland Security that focused on cyber supply chain risk management issues. So I'll be talking to you about kind of the getting ready for CMMC and what all it entails, and looking forward to it.
Our agenda for today is we'll start off with how you can best prepare for CMMC, and then we'll move into a discussion on the digital supply chain security, and then third-party risk management. I'll be covering that, and then we'll go into a Q&A session at the end. It'll be about 15 minutes where we'll answer some of your questions. So let's jump into preparing for CMMC.
Thank you. Like I mentioned, I am an attorney with Warden Smith that focuses on privacy and cybersecurity issues, and really got my feet wet in this space with the Department of Homeland Security focusing on its cyber supply chain risk management task force. We were looking at questions about supply chains and cyber risks to determine best practices for the civilian side of our economy on that task force. And while we were doing that, the Department of Defense published the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification program. And to put it bluntly, it's a fantastic way to address this environment that is seeing an increase in the threats that all kinds of businesses are facing, from small enterprises all the way up to massive enterprises like what we saw in the SolarWinds and just the cascading data breaches that came from that. So with that in mind, we all know that these data breaches are on the rise, and whether it's Target or Home Depot that kicked off kind of the public perception of these issues back in the 2010s, or Equifax and the DNC hack that kind of also brought it to life in the public mind, we've more recently seen Kaseya and SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange server compromises that have really brought home that third-party risk is a huge vector for this kind of a threat in the cyber supply chain to all kinds of businesses. And it's really captured the imagination of the public and policymakers, which is why I suspect that the CMMC program is kind of going to be a baseline and a starting point for these kinds of regulations and laws and requirements, not an endpoint. So getting smart on these issues right now is fantastically important for any kind of business, but especially for those in the defense industry. And as we walk through all of these kinds of breaches, a crucial piece that keeps showing up is the role that third parties, supply chains, vendors, suppliers, partners, whatever your industry's vernacular calls them, they're always popping up in these big breaches. So these breaches are very expensive. They're expensive to remediate. They can force a company to find new sources or goods in a hurry, which is hardly conducive to striking the best economic deal. And especially in the defense side of things, it can really impinge on national security and critical supplies that the defense industrial base requires. And they can cause a business's contracts to get canceled. They can have just cascading effects all throughout. So proactive efforts to address these problems are crucial, and the natural solution is the development of a third-party data security program that can help reduce risk. And the CMMC certification program attempts to do just that. CMMC is in its first year of rollout, which will continue through September 30th, 2025, and it attempts to get a unified standard for implementing cybersecurity controls that are appropriate to the sensitivity of information and the critical nature of the systems that are at issue in the defense industrial base, both up and down the supply chain. So the Department of Defense contracts that are subject to the program will require third-party auditors to certify that an entity meets the level required by a contract for the entity to qualify to bid on that contract. We'll talk more about those levels in just a minute, but importantly, there's no self-certification in the CMMC program. By the time the program is fully implemented, that fact alone is possible to increase the overall cost of cyber supply chain in defense contracts and in any kind of non-defense contracts that adopt a similar system. But the recovery is going to come from not having any kind of contracts broken because of the heightened level of security, because we are expecting to see a significant increase in the security of those supply chains as a result. While CMMC was developed by the Department of Defense for the DIB, Defense Industrial Base, SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, and Kaseya make clear that, we need to be thinking broader as an economy and as a society, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. The Department of Defense had the Defense Industrial Base in mind, but for corporate procurement, for any kind of industrial actor, it can be, the CMMC program can be a very good baseline from which you begin to build out your own procurement and security strategy for the third parties that your business relies on. So like I said, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and implementing those same third-party auditing requirements with robust standards is a fantastic way to increase the security in corporate procurement on the civilian side as well. So just kind of summation, required for defense industry, but absolutely applicable to everyone else. The CMMC is divided into 5 levels, and there are 2 sides of each level. There are practices on the one hand and processes on the other, and you need to meet the requirements of both levels to qualify for that contract that requires a certain level. So practices refers to the control domains and the level of sophistication of technological, administrative, organizational, and physical safeguards that are in place. Processes refer to the level of institutionalization of those same safeguards. So processes, we would move at first from them simply being performed, and then we move to level 2 where they're documented, and level 3 where they're managed, 4 where they're reviewed, and then 5 where institutionally they get optimized. And for practices, we progress from basic cyber hygiene at level 1, intermediate and good cyber hygiene at levels 2 and 3, having proactive approaches to those domain controls at level 4, and topping out at advanced and progressive approaches to those domains and controls at level 5. I'll note here that the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification program will require at least level 1 for all federal contract information. So once a contract is subject to this program, if you have not gotten certified at level 1, you likely will not be allowed to bid on that contract. So some level of certification for any contractors or subcontractors that want to bid is going to be required. Level 2 is a transitional step. It can be used to document progress towards higher levels, but there will be very few contracts that will likely be put out that you have to hit level 2 to qualify to bid upon them. At level 3, we start getting into controlled unclassified information that you can bid on. So any contract where you would have CUI would require at least level 3 for those contractors to meet. At level 4, we're focusing on advanced persistent threats. So any information that the Defense Department would be concerned about APTs getting access to or interfering with would likely come in at a level 4. And level 5, those are the most sophisticated threats. There will be fewer contracts at level 5, but they will likely be some of the more lucrative contracts as well. So the most sensitive and critical systems are going to be at level 5 and will descend down the less critical or sensitive that gets. You can use that leveling system as a means in your own corporate procurement as well if you're not bidding on a defense contract or if you're looking for non-defense suppliers and contracts as well, where you would basically decide, okay, for this project that we want to expand into, we want to have a similar security as what would be required for level 3, for example, controlled unclassified information, because it's going to have some of our most important trade secrets that are involved. And as a corporation, during your procurement process, you would build that into the contracting process as well. The last bit here is to make sure you have experts on your contracting team and your compliance team. Getting compliant with CMMC, like I said, there's no self-certification. So an external partner coming in and saying, yes, I think you've done what you need to do, or here are some requirements you need to increase your encryption level here. This data in transit was not adequately protected. Anyone coming outside your organization in to consult with that expertise is going to be invaluable as you're trying to comply with CMMC so that you can bid on these contracts. It would also be beneficial for any organization, defense or not, to consult with those experts as well to figure out, okay, what information do we absolutely need secure? How can we craft contract language that will ensure that they're following whatever level it is that we've decided is appropriate? If it's level 5, you know, it's $1 billion trade secret and you absolutely need it to be secure. Level 5, how do we build that into our procurement contracts? Get in touch with some kind of expertise so that they can come in and draft that for you, work it into your procurement process, and be a boon to your organization while dealing with that. But you don't need that level of security for every contract. So if it's a cloud storage provider, for example, that's not handling much sensitive, but you don't want to have a data breach notification that has to go out, maybe that could be at level 1 or level 2. Reaching out beyond your organization, developing that contract language and building it into your internal processes and procedures is going to be the most efficient way to cut down on the contracts that you might have canceled or have to cancel, and to increase the overall level of security in your corporate procurement environment. So with that, I will push forward and we can hear about digital supply chain security.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. So talking about digital supply chain security, and we've heard a lot about it within the news over the last year, specifically because of what we saw with SolarWinds, Kaseya, with Exchange, and all the different ransomware attacks. So I want to focus on 3 different aspects with regards to the different attack vectors that cyber criminals like to do to gain access into your supply chain. So we're looking at software, we're looking at hardware, and then we're looking at remote access. You know, the software is kind of the easy one because of the electronic capability of it, where cyber criminals are able to get inside of an organization, get down to their research development teams, to the developers, and insert malicious code into those applications so that when it goes out, it now spreads like wildfire to all of their customers. And that's what we saw with SolarWinds. It even took the organization FireEye to discover that, hey, someone stole all of our tools. How'd they get in there? Saw that it came through via the SolarWinds, that whole update package. And that's one of the big ones that we've seen. Hardware is one we don't hear as often, but it is still prevalent because of the fact that cyber criminals are getting into a organization's physical building or gaining access to the physical hardware or electronic systems components and manipulating them to provide them access. There was an article that came out a few years ago regarding Supermicro, which is a motherboard manufacturing company. And the article that came out stated that the Chinese, a nation state, had planted secret microchips onto the motherboard that was allowing communications to flow back to the motherland, back home. Unfortunately, that story turned out to be false. Now, I have a friend of mine, a colleague, who basically thought, yeah, but that's possible, that could happen. And he got his hands on a very common firewall that's used in the industries. And he was able to get a hold of one, which isn't hard. He purchased one, took it apart, got onto the main board, and dropped in his own microchip that was very difficult to detect. He challenged all of his friends to go, hey, can anybody spot the chip that I added, which in essence was capturing all the keystrokes when somebody logged into that firewall, capturing all the configuration changes and any of the configuration that was in the system, and then sending it back to his command and control server that he had set up. Now, it took him a couple of weeks to research it. It took him a little while to figure it out, but he was able to do it, and he demonstrated it for us at a conference. So while the Supermicro story is a little was false, it's not unfeasible that this type of activity could happen. It's a little slower, can't go as quick as what you'd have with a software attack, but it is something that has to be considered and be aware. So when it comes to hardware and getting delivery from a supplier, that a chain of custody or some sort of evidence chain is created to be able to protect against any type of man-in-the-middle manipulation, so to speak. The third one, we talk about remote access, and this is another one of the common ones where I know a lot of customers get very concerned because now they've got, in essence, untrusted people coming in to access their environment. We saw this with Target years ago, where you had cyber criminals gain access into an HVAC company and then from there leveraged their way into the Target organization and was able to steal all the credit cards. Long story short, but the remote access solutions are crucial to have and policies to have within your organization, which we're going to go into. So here on the next slide, we're going to look at a breakdown of those cybersecurity, the digital supply chain. And we looking at the materials from within the organization when we have disruption of those physical materials. We have cyber criminals getting in, breaking in, corporate espionage, getting in and trying to disrupt that supply chain. We're seeing, while it's not an attack, we're seeing a big issue right now with new cars, where there is, I think it's in Louisville, Kentucky, there is huge, like, looks like the size of 20 football fields full of cars, brand new cars, waiting for a particular chip to come in so they can be installed in the cars and go through their final quality inspection and then being sent on to the dealerships. All these cars can't go anywhere because they're waiting on this one particular hardware chip that has been slowed up because of the pandemic that's been going on. So you have those type of material disruptions. It's not anything neglectful or anything that's as a result of a cyber attack. It's just with regards to supply and a lack of resources from the chip manufacturers. Then you get into policy violations with regards to organizations, product tampering. We had a little while ago, or we heard in the news, over at the Tesla factory, where you had a nation state approach an employee going, hey, we need you to plug this thumb drive into a computer because we want to collect information. We're going to pay you $1 million. So they were ready to offer up money. Now the employee did the good thing, turned it into their security office and was able to prosecute. But these are the type of actions within industrial espionage, but also nation states, cyber criminals are trying to do to be able to gain access into those particular environments. Then we start talking about malware. We saw this with CC Cleaner several years ago. The NotPetya attack came in through MEDOC. Those type of supply chain attacks. Then we have service interruption, where you look at Colonial Pipeline that happened with their ransomware attack. Granted, while the attack happened on their point of sale machines, they ended up shutting down the operation technology or their OT side to be able to protect that network to prevent the ransomware attack from spreading over there. But it kind of caused a certain alarm within the community, and a lot of people did a big run on the gas, but caused a service disruption on that. compromise, infiltration, exfiltration. Essentially, one of the supply chain attacks that we see is when cyber criminals get in through either that remote access, or they're getting in through phishing attacks, social engineering to gain access and cause particular problems. So now looking at those supply chain attacks, now as an organization, we want to go ahead and look at how to protect those critical assets. And so when we have our critical assets, we as an organization, or you as an organization, want to make sure that you're able to go through and determine what is critical in your organization. We look at a particular cola manufacturer in Atlanta. It could be their formula for how they make for that recipe. It could be a chicken restaurant chain, and there are 11 herbs and spices. Or it could be a hospital, or a law firm, or it could be a manufacturing organization. You're going to have things that are critical to the operation of your organization that have to have that extra layer of protection in there. And so it's important to go through and be able to identify your assets. First of all, you got to know what to protect, not only hardware, but also software as well. And then you're going to go through and classify those, whether it's low, medium, or high, based on other criteria of what's important. Is it something that if it gets attacked, we've got to wake the CEO up, we got to get the CISO up, we got to report about certain things. And eventually you come to some sort of a business impact analysis, and that's decided upon your legal team, your InfoSec team, the business themselves, the application owners, and coming up with that impact analysis and coming up with that scale of priority, what you're going to have on what has to be protected. And you're going to look at revenue impact. Is this going to be something that impacts us? Are we going to be shut down for 3 days or a week because the system has gone offline? Does it contain personal identifiable information? If it's a hospital, or if you're an organization that collects that kind of information, that's something that has to be protected as well. Sometimes regulations come into play to be able to make you be aware of what you need to protect within your organization. So when we start looking at securing your data, we can break this up into 4 different categories. You're going to basically go through and you want to audit the access to that critical data. You want to know who's going in there, and you want to review it. When we saw the Colonial Pipeline attack, that was because of old credentials for a VPN. They hadn't been disengaged, they hadn't been deactivated, and they were still out there. They'd also been discovered in a data breach, and so the cyber criminals leveraged that to gain access. So it's crucial to go through on a regular, frequent basis to make sure you know who's getting in there and whether those accounts are active. Also being able to monitor that access, anybody and only the people that are necessary to gain access to that. Requesting bill of materials, not only a hardware bill of materials, but one of the big topics now, especially in manufacturing and industrial control systems, is looking at a software bill of materials. What kind of software has gone in there? Have you used third-party products as well? Are you using open source software? A lot of the time, cyber criminals will leverage that, discover a vulnerability, and sometimes organizations aren't aware of what software has actually got into that. Is it all homegrown, or has it been a collaboration of a variety of different pieces of software? Finally, we look at remote access and collaboration with your vendors for remote access. You've got people that are going to come in and service that product, that platform for you. They're the experts, and they need to be able to gain access to that. I came out of the energy space where we were a vendor to a lot of power plants, and a lot of our discussions focused around what kind of remote access we were going to have. How were we going to authenticate that it was really us? What kind of logging was going to go on? And so that, again, becomes a collaboration with your vendors, making sure that they're aware of your policies, that you're able to monitor who's getting in to each of those. Now, what ends up happening with all of this is needing a repository to store those. And one of the more common platforms is where we start to incorporate GRC. And GRC is governance, risk, and compliance. And it basically breaks out where you have your governance is your ability to be able to monitor the policies that you set up. So you have your policies, with what's going on with your governance. You're looking at your regulations, your standards, policies, practices, and having that all in place, and then making sure you're able to go in and audit against that, making sure that what is being said is what is actually happening. And your governance, you're going to look at your policies. So you have your policies that are created from your various department heads or your executive management or upper management. That policies are going to then go into your contracts. Your processes are going to come out of that, whether you're leveraging regulations, guidance like NIST, the Cybersecurity Framework, or the Cmmc. But looking at all of those different controls that come into play and being able to have that governance, being able to audit that, make sure that what actually has been written is actually happening. So we look at the second stage of this, or the second aspect, we look at risk management. And risk management is crucial when it comes back to our critical assets, because the risk management is looking at the different assets, looking at and gaining an understanding of what type of threats are out there against those systems and how are we managing that. Security is all about risk, and you've got to know what assets you've got to be able to determine what risks, what kind of risk exposure you want to have, and storing that in a risk register is key. But within your risk management, you need to have your plan. You need to plan your work and work your plan, have your authorizations, incorporate that into the organization. Automation is great, makes things a lot easier. But with regards to your risk register, you've got all your risks identified, have your application and business owners reviewing those on a quarterly basis, going through and making sure folks are aware of their risk requirements that they've got to have. Looking at the third aspect of this is, of course, compliance. We had the governance aspect. So now we get into compliance. And compliance breaks into 4 aspects: monitor, assess, audits, and reporting. And essentially, you're going through with your compliance. Granted, you're going to have your regulations and your frameworks, but part of that compliance also is almost a resilience, so to speak. You're going through, you're doing your monitoring, you're looking at the threat landscape, you're looking at what's going on in the industry, what kind of different cyber attacks are going on, making sure that you're able to be aware of those and know that you have the resilience to protect against them. You're going to get information from your SIEMs, your security incident and event monitoring systems. They're collecting hundreds and thousands and millions of logs from all of the equipment and going through and processing it. And then you have your security operations center goes through looking for that needle in the haystack. They work tirelessly to go through and make sure that they're not seeing anything unusual, but those systems are designed to be able to look for unusual activity. Then we start looking at assessing your different systems, your processes, and your audits, going back to your governance and making sure that what's being said and what's been written is actually what's being done. Your audits, whether it's external audits or internal audits that are going on throughout the year. There are issues where you have one set of requirements and another set of requirements, and they almost butt heads against each other. One might say, don't have anything out that says it's classified. And then you could have another one that says, identify and document all things that are classified in an organization. So, it kind of, and label it. So sometimes those do butt heads. And so you have to kind of balance that. And then, of course, you've got your reporting within your internal and external that you're going to have, again, whether that's regulatory, whether it's compliance, or it's your own C-suite reporting back to them to make sure that they are aware of how you're following your own policies and procedures in compliance with the regulations overall. So looking at your digital risks supply chain, you want to make sure that you're aware of all your different assets. You want to make sure you're aware of the vendors that are coming into your organization. Have a GRC program established, operational, going through, have resources dedicated to it, so that way they can keep an eye on the policies, making sure they're being followed, and have the audits to make sure that everything is being done. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric and talk about third-party risk management.
Thanks, James. So yeah, jumping into third-party risk management, first step in this whole risk management process is to identify what those risks are. And we're going to start with looking at, what's the workflow and what are the, what's the threat environment look like. So understanding that workflows is usually comprised in a data map, where does the data reside within the organization and its third parties, and then also data flow. How does the data move between these different units? Who has access to it at different points, which applications are utilizing it, and which entities. These could be external entities like these other third parties. And so once you understand where it's going, then you look at those different risks to it, and this is understanding that threat environment. Some things that, of course, you're looking at would be loss of availability. This is when you're not able to access certain systems or access certain data, which then is going to lead to lost productivity or loss of reputation. A big part of this is loss of data. So this would be either data exfiltration, theft, or with ransomware, like that loss of availability of the data. And then a lot of this ends up coming down to, of course, a financial risk. There is going to be some sort of impact when the risks are realized. And so, there's going to be operational impact and then ultimately some impact to the bottom line. And then there's the lack of compliance, some risk there of you not being in compliance due to the vendor security. And I put that in this whole list because obviously the business is looking at it from that business perspective. It's not going to be this simply black and white. Yes, obviously lack of compliance is a huge issue, but they're going to balance that with everything else. So once you understand that, you can then identify what these risks are. And when I talk about risk, we're referring to what's the impact, how much is it going to impact the company or its customers, and then what is the likelihood of that occurring. And then those together are going to form that risk. And the company would then say, well, what's our tolerance for this risk? What controls do we need to have in place? Some of that is mandated, of course, with the Cmmc. And then others, you're going to either go beyond that to implement additional controls to bring that back into line with what your comfort level is. So that's a very structured approach to this, and you're going to end up applying that, of course, to your own processes, but then also as you mandate different things for the vendors to ensure that they are complying with this, and that across the whole data flow that you're applying a standard set of security, so you're not protecting it within the organizational bounds, and then as soon as it moves to a third party, you're losing that. That's where that weak part of the chain would occur, and we want to avoid that. So moving into the next step here, first we want to have a policy. We want to have a way for the organization to express its expectations. How are we going to manage the third-party risk? And then this also helps to ensure that we're applying a standard set of criteria to each vendor, and not simply letting one vendor be less secure because we've dealt with them for a long time. So to implement this policy, it's going to say, what is our criteria? How are we going to conduct that evaluation? And then how are we going to bring them back into compliance? Obviously, if some vendor is out of compliance, you're not just going to switch immediately. There's a huge cost to that, and there'd be an impact to your customers and to your operations. But you can't have that weakness in your supply chain. So how long are we going to give them to remediate these risks, and how are we going to validate that once they say that they have remediated it? So you're going to evaluate the suppliers and the other third parties first when you're selecting them and going through that kind of whole contractual process. And many use vendor questionnaires. It makes it easy to apply a standard set of questions, and then you can use a quantitative process, assigning a mathematical value to the different items to easily evaluate them. However, things aren't always as cut and dry, so there's usually back and forth. Somebody says, I don't do that, but that's because I have this compensating control. And so you have to understand, how does that really impact the risk? And does this really meet your requirements, or is that something that has to be remediated? You also look at attestations or security reports. So the vendor will undergo different things like either a SOC 2 audit, or they'll be conducting regular vulnerability scans or pen tests, and then their own risk assessments. So they could share either these reports or summaries or attestations that say we conducted this and this is the the summary of the results. But to review those to ensure that they are doing what they say that they're doing. And this is something you're going to do on regular intervals. So usually that's annually, and when you're initiating the relationship. Next, some vendors may actually require an on-site visit to confirm some of those controls. You're going to want to specify in your policy when you would conduct this, and then determine who's going to conduct those on-site visits. I mentioned reassessing the vendors annually, and at that point you would determine if there's something that is not within compliance to then require them to remediate that and then revalidate that they are back in compliance after they've implemented the remediation. So all this helps ensure that you're implementing that standard set of security. Now, looking at the CMMC, I just wanted to kind of highlight different things. Obviously, there's a lot in the CMMC, but I thought I'd pull out some of the requirements and just show you how this would apply to your third-party agreements and third-party risk management process. So you'll see some of the reference numbers here, but we see requiring MFA for third-party access. So you're looking at the workflow and you see, okay, what third parties are accessing the data here or accessing our systems, then implementing the MFA for those and requiring that, or ensuring that information is properly destroyed so that they don't just reuse systems or other things without going through the process of properly purging that information when contracts terminate or when you move or migrate data from one platform to another. And then also ensuring the encryption. Encryption is a huge thing. It's basically a standard across the board in almost every best practice or standard you see out there, and ensuring the encryption of the CUI throughout its life cycle. So it's at rest, when it's sitting on data storage somewhere, and when it's moving through these different systems, and ensuring that you're implementing this proper control of the encryption material that you, let's say you're storing in a cloud provider, that cloud provider, typically you're kind of splitting up this key material so that the cloud provider doesn't have access and without the portions of the keys that you have custody of. That way you're eliminating that risk of full compromise of the data on one side of the equation. We also see here meeting continuity and redundancy and availability requirements. That's a huge section, so I'll just put a couple of bullet points here on different things. First determining how are we going to restore systems to their operational state? How do we get them back to the point where we can function on them normally? And how long is that going to take? You want this to meet, we call your RPO and RTO, so recovery point objective, recovery time objective. How long is it going to take for us to restore to the operational state, and how much data would potentially be lost? If you're backing up every hour and you happen to fail right before the next backup cycle, well, then you're losing almost an hour of data. Is that something you're comfortable with? We're going to want to specify that and then ensure that these third parties can meet those requirements. And then we see on the next one down here, RM 3.147, ensuring that providers are using supported products. If they are using unsupported products, and this certainly happens in manufacturing, you want to ensure that there's additional controls to reduce that risk to appropriate levels. In some cases that you just can't, and then that's something where it's going to have to be replaced. But yes, we find in many cases these things are tied to expensive equipment, so it's definitely something you want to specify in there. Otherwise, you end up with systems that are quite out of date and are never updated. Moving to the next one here, ensuring that the service providers themselves have conducted their own risk assessments, and then this is something, of course, you're going to be evaluating to ensure that that is meeting the requirements. We see vulnerability scans and penetration tests are performed. Mentioned reviewing those reports. You certainly want to ensure that that is taking place, and then that they're remediating those discovered vulnerabilities. So it's not enough just to run the scan, but now you got to take some action. And based on the level of risk, if it's a critical vulnerability, then you should be remediating that right away, versus a low vulnerability that may require a bit more time and effort. You're going to give them additional time to remediate that. Requiring third parties to share the indicators of compromise. This is huge. You want, if there is a breach, you need to know so you can meet your own requirements, and that needs to be stipulated and with the vendors so that they inform you promptly, and then you can conduct the rest of your investigation and notification if required. So We're going to next move into some Q&A. Let's see here. First question appears to be, what happens if we choose to self-certify, and how would that affect us?
So, like I said in my presentation, there's no self-certification. You need to have a third party come in and certify you in order to, qualify as you hit level 3 or you hit level 4, whatever level you're trying to establish yourself at. It needs to be a third party auditor organization that comes in and certifies you that way. However, you are encouraged to do self-assessments beforehand as a cost-saving measure so that you don't go into the third-party assessment sure that you're going to hit level 3 and then end up at level 2, and now you can't bid on contracts that deal with CUI. So there's self-assessment, but it's not self-certification under the CMMC program.
Great. We have another question here. It says, what are the expected costs to become CMMC compliant?
I can weigh in on that a little bit, but not with any numbers, because it's going to depend on where you're at, where you want to get to, and how complicated your systems and processes are. So do you already have half the practices already in place and you just need help institutionalizing them, or are you starting from scratch and you want to bid on the most expensive DoD contract? Those are going to be very different costs to get to under the CMMC program. So I can't really give a number, but the more complicated you want to get, the more sophisticated information and systems you want to provide, the more it's going to cost on average to institutionalize them and get the adequate processes in place. Practices in place.
I see just some may be pretty close to being compliant already, or they have a long way to go. I see another question here. It says, I'm a supplier or subcontractor. What are the primes looking for when they look at my business?
Is that one directed to me?
James, you got a good answer here?
What are primes looking for? Oh, primary bidder. Okay, what are primary bidder looking for when they look at my business? Most likely when it comes to looking at requests for proposals and those kind of things, where they're looking at your organization from a cybersecurity standpoint, if you're providing a product, they're going to want to know from a cybersecurity standpoint, they're going to want to know what programs you have in place. What are you doing to make sure that you don't suffer a data breach? Do you have multi-factor authentication on your critical systems? Are you have a strong security culture, at least security awareness program? Are you doing any type of phishing assessments? What does your organizational security culture look like? That's kind of one of the key things they look at. Then they're going to look at the product, and in the product they want to make sure, hey, are we going to get updates? So if you're using Windows as the operating system for the product you're giving us, are you going to provide us the updates? Are you going to let us know when those are getting done? So you've got vulnerability management, change management that goes in there. They're going to want to know, how many users need access? What kind of remote access do you need? They're going to know, do you have any certifications? And for years, that was always a struggle, where to get some type of certification for a vendor, there's different ones that you can do within the industry, but that's reflective of your organization. When it comes to the actual product, there's a handful that are out there, and it's going to depend again on what industry you're in. But if there's a certification that you can have that's gone through and verified that, yeah, the practices and procedures and policies for your product meet that certain level, like the CMMC, then that can go a long way and make the discussions a lot easier with them.
The only thing I would add is, for subcontractors on DoD contracts, if the CMMC program's in place, unless you're just providing commercial off-the-shelf technology, you're providing a Google Chromebook or something like that. Unless that's the case, you'll also need to meet a certain level of CMMC certification. So
Right.
Just because you're not the prime contractor does not mean you won't need a level of certification as a subcontractor. Now, typically, I think it will be around the same level of certification. So if it's a level 3 contract, it'll need to be level 3 sub. But I could see a scenario where for certain elements of a subcontract, it might allow for a lower, but that would probably be atypical.
Good point. I have another question here. It says, what's the easiest way to secure a work from home office?
So for me, one of the key practices is to make sure when you've got your employees working from home that they are establishing some type of secure connection back to your office, whether that's VPN is the common practice, where that way they are having that encrypted connection going from their home office back to the work environment, and then being able to carry on with business from there. Another thing is one of my common tips that I like to give is if you're working from home and you've got a work machine, make sure you can, or try to get that actually connected to your router that you would have at home rather than using the Wi-Fi, especially when doing calls. It kind of gets away from the digital security aspect with supply chain, but when you're on Wi-Fi, you could have a great Wi-Fi system, but they have a tendency to go out. If you can be hardwired right into your home router, it gives you a stronger connection. It's more reliable. Also, it removes the opportunity of any type of Wi-Fi type attack as well. So usually making sure that your work machine is your work machine at home, not letting the kids play their games or Fortnite or anything on there. Make sure that you keep it compartmentalized and isolated.
I'd also say keeping that data, if you can, within the organizational bounds. If you have virtual desktops, then whatever machine they're using at home, they connect into that, and then the data stays on organizational systems, or if it's a cloud platform, to keep it within there. So it's not downloaded onto all of these different remote machines, providing another avenue for that data to be exfiltrated.
Yep.
And just the last thing I would add on this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but just securing it with eyes wide open, that a remote workstation will most likely be less secure than a controlled environment in the office where you can have more physical monitoring of who's coming and going and who has access to the machine and who doesn't. Eyes wide open, that remote will almost always be less secure no matter what technical protections you put in place.
Good. We have another question here. It says, do we need to pursue CMMC if we do not have any CUI?
For that one, the answer is yes. As long as you have federal contract information, if your contract is within the CMMC program, federal contract information would trigger level 1 certification. CUI would trigger level 3. So it will be a different level that you have to meet, but you still would have some kind of CMMC requirement.
Good to know. Here's another question. If I use a subcontractor, what happens if they aren't compliant with CMMC and I'm bidding on a CMMC contract?
So if you're bidding on a CMMC contract, you're going to want to use subcontractors that have been certified at the level that you need them to be certified at. So you'll have a certification documentation that they've complied with it before you rely upon them for your bid on a contract. And if they're non-compliant, you'll need to resource it, or if there might be a mechanism within your contract specifically that talks about it. But in general, you would need to look to resourcing that with someone who is compliant at the level that you need it to be at under your contract.
Here's another question. Is there a general time frame to become compliant? How long should this certification take?
So the regulation final came out this past year. We're still in the first year of it. Final rollout will be in 2025. And at that point, most DoD contracts will be requiring some level of CMMC compliance. So it depends on if you're looking to bid on contracts today that have a CMMC requirement, or if you're not looking to bid on those yet, you can take a little bit longer time frame. But if you're bidding on one today that has a requirement, then if you want to win the bid, you should be compliant at the level that it requires.
Got it. So I got another question here. It says, what's the best way to prepare for the certification process?
Self-assessment is a good way to, have an idea that you're going to meet this level. The CMMC criteria are publicly available. You can see what you need to do. Bring someone else in who might not be a third-party auditor but has expertise in this field and can tell you, yeah, it looks from my outside perspective like, based on the documentation you've given me, that you are meeting this, this, and this, but you should probably increase this domain or greater institutionalize this process. So self-assessment, but also partnering with organizations that can bring in additional expertise if that's not on your team already, before you go through the actual expense of trying to get certified at the certain level that you'll need to be.
Well, that wraps up our questions. Thanks everybody for attending our webinar here, and stay safe.
Take care.
Have a great one.